I first met Bill under unusual circumstances at Stanford, and maybe he can tell us a little about it.
Yeah, so my first 2 years, my hobby at Stanford was breaking into buildings and exploring the steam tunnels. And at that time, this is 64, 65, that was not a terrorist act. In fact, there were a number of other people that were exploring the steam tunnels, and occasionally we bumped into each other. I always wore a very heavy leather jacket down there, even though it was 120 degrees, because if the steam pipe broke, you were probably going to get cooked, and I somehow thought that would protect me. It probably would just made it last longer. But so I was in Torreon Hall one day, and somebody else was running through the lobby and going down the steps, and he fell, and all of these keys went spreading across the floor. And I jumped up and talked to him and said, "Oh, you're collecting keys too?" And we traded keys, and I ended up with a whole bunch more keys. In any case, 2 years later, I'm reading the Stanford Daily, and I see that the DC Power, or the GT&E had been building a beautiful building back in the hills, and they ran into money problems, and they sold 6 acres plus this building that was a shell at that point to Stanford for $500,000. And 9 months later, I'm driving to Rosati's, and I see this very official-looking sign, Stanford style, says DC Power's Lab. And immediately it goes in my mind, I have to come back here tonight, 11 o'clock, with all my tools and break into this building. And this is far from campus. It's out in the hills. And so I show up at 11 o'clock at night, and it's an enormous disappointment. All the doors are open, the lights are on, people are in there, lots of people, and they're working on this beautiful PDP-6 computer. And Steve was the section head, I think was your CS section head, or anyway, he was the technical leader of all of the, and this machine was for graduate students and graduate work, and I was an undergraduate. But anyway, that's how I discovered the building.
Yes, we were big on security. We turned off password protection and told people, don't waste computer, don't use up all the computer time, because if you do anything that's obnoxious, we'd have to put in security. You don't really want that. It worked fine for several years.
So when I found this, now I'd already taken a few programming courses, and I really liked programming. And when I discovered, but down on campus, the machines down there was the 7094 and a girls 5000 and upgraded to a 5500, and they were kept behind glass walls. And to use them for a course, you'd had like 2 minutes of compute time is what you were allowed, and you would use punch cards, build your deck, hand it to someone across the counter, and a couple of hours later you'd come back and you'd get your results back.
If you were lucky.
Pardon?
If you were lucky.
Yeah, if you were lucky. And there was no real interaction with the computer. And the PDP-6 was the first time-sharing system, one of the first commercial time-sharing systems. And so I think initially the PDP-6 with peripherals it had.
I believe it was marginally commercial.
And that's true. Very true. And it could support initially 4 to 8 users simultaneously when it just had deck tapes and limited amount of core memory. I really wanted to use the machine, and Les Ernest, who's an administrator that over time I began to appreciate him. In fact, in later life I appreciate him even more, which is, as an administrator, he always found a way to say yes if he could. And I've learned later that the instinctive reaction of most administrators is to say no, because that stops problems early on. So my thing to him was I wanted to as an undergraduate, I wanted to use the computer. And his response, and to be honest, I expected him to say, I'm sorry, this is for graduate students. But what he did say was, well, this is for graduate students, and they have priority, but you're a Stanford student, and if there are excess cycles and resources that aren't being claimed, then you can use them. So I ended up spending all my nights up there, and often I had the whole machine to myself, and I rarely went to classes, and it's fortunate I never really had ambitions to go on to graduate school.
You get all the computer time you could need anyway.
That's right.
What about Spacewar? I have a vested interest in Spacewar. Having written the first version on a PDP-1.
Yes. So I was, before I had discovered the AI lab up in the DC Powers building, I had somehow gotten into a back room at Polio Hall. There was a main room where the big machines were, and off to the side there was another smaller room that had a PDP-1 computer. And it had a display on it, a DEC Type 30 display. In fact, it's the same display that's being used now on the PDP-1 at the Computer History Museum. And somehow, during the daytime, when I was there, Spacewar was running. And that was very unusual because Spacewar, the original versions of Spacewar were running on big computers that would typically be charging $400, $500, $600 per hour out to the various users. And the only time that Spacewar could be played would be in the midnight hours by system programmers when the machine was completely idle, and that would be 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. But somehow during the daytime, I guess I happened to be passing through and they were demoing the program to somebody. I don't remember the circumstance, but I was told that if you came back at 2 o'clock in the morning, you could play Spacewar. And the instructions on how to load the paper tape were right there. So that night, I was back at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was loading the paper tape, and it was about halfway loaded when Pat Stadell, one of the graduate students in the other building, the George Forsyth building, came storming in because somebody had killed her program that was dumping all of the discs to tape. And I was a treasurer. So anyway, that thwarted my attempt to play Spacewar on the PDP-1. But then later up at the AI lab, one evening, Dave Poole, Phil Pettit, and Bill Weir wrote a version of Spacewar, and the lore has it that they did it in a single evening. From the time they started, they had, and it very likely was true. I wasn't there, and I don't know, but they were all very good programmers. And so that was my first real encounter with Spacewar, was on the PDP-6. And that was a time train system, and it had a feature added to the operating system called Spacewar mode, so that a program that was running could tell the operating system, I need to run religiously 30 times a second or whatever it is. And once that program got control of the machine, it wouldn't, until it did a certain type of operation, and I forget what it was, maybe it was a system call or something, some sort of a call, it would not relinquish the processor. And Spacewar mode was actually used for many, many different real-time applications, but I think Spacewar was the one that first implemented that. All of the hand-eye stuff that Stanford did quite a bit of required real-time processing, plus the music program, I think, on playback requires real-time. So that...
I'm sure that the feature needed a test system.